600 years before Christ, the nation of Israel had become so wicked in their land that God said, I just can't overlook the wickedness, and I'm going to dispossess you, and I'm going to leave the land barren for 70 years, and you'll not be permitted to live on it. I'm going to let another nation come and take you captive. And he used the great king Nebuchadnezzar of the Babylonians to do this. Now, we're going to start our story now from the book of Daniel, because Daniel was one of those Israelites 600 years before Christ who was dispossessed from the land. Now, Daniel was not wicked. He was a godly young man and probably was just a teenager when his people were taken out of the land, and he was a captive in Babylonia. When Daniel was a very old man, after he lived in captivity for 70 years, he realized it was time for the 70 years to be over, and that he was praying that God would then let the people, the special people, go back into their own land. And the story of this prayer is found in the 9th chapter of Daniel. And as a result of Daniel's prayer in the 9th chapter, God gave him a vision. Or he gave him several visions during his life, but he gave him another one here, and let him know some of the things that must happen to the nation of Israel. We'll be reading beginning the 23rd verse in just a little while, the 9th chapter and 23rd verse of Daniel. But let me review some of the things we've already found out that are in the future concerning the nation of Israel. We found out that the Bible predicts that one time that all the nations surrounding Israel would be confederate against them. That is, they would have an agreement that they were going to annihilate them. And this would happen after God had brought the people, or a substantial portion of the people, back into the land. You'll recall the order is he would first restore the land, then he would restore the people to the land in unbelief. They were to come back into the land still not recognizing their God as their God. And while they were there in the land, in unbelief, the land would begin to prosper. But the enemies all around them would be against them, and they would have a confederacy against them. Then we find out that God prophesies concerning some of these countries that had this confederacy. The Bible tells about, for instance, this great power to the north, who most Bible scholars interpret to mean Russia. And the Bible tells us that Russia will come down, or this northern power will come down with great forces and many allies. And they will come down with the purpose of annihilating the nation of Israel. They will consider that Israel doesn't have anywhere near enough armaments to withstand them, and they'll come in with millions of soldiers just to take over the land, because there's something there they want. The Bible says they come for a spoil, or to take a prize. Then the Bible tells us another group of nations remonstrate with them and says, now you're going to go down there, you better not go down there. But the remonstrating nations don't do anything about it. They'll not engage this great northern power. They'll let them go right on into the land. And after they get into the land, then we find out some very great things are going to happen. There's going to be a tremendous earthquake, a shaking of the land, and there's going to be all kind of heavenly phenomenon, great hail storms and so forth, and that in the confusion, the armies that have come in to annihilate the nation of Israel will start fighting one another. And we found out that this is the usual thing when overwhelming armies throughout the ages have come against Israel, that in each case Israel, with its very small force, has not really had to fight. The nations annihilated themselves. We found this Way back in the book of Judges, we found an instance that happened probably 1,200 years before Christ, when the nation of Israel was in the land, and the Midianites came against them with a great army. And we remember that that under Gideon, that the way the Midianites were defeated is they fought themselves in the confusion. Each one set himself against his brother, it says. Then later on, about 1,100 years before Christ, or between 10 and 1,100 years before Christ, the first king of Israel, King Saul, and his son were in a war trying to protect their land from the Philistines. And we find here again that the way the Philistines were defeated was they set themselves one against the other. And then we found another time, which happened about probably 600 or 700 years before Christ. We found the good King Jehoshaphat was subject to being annihilated by three nations that were confederate against him. These were the nations of Moab and Ammon and Edom. And we found out that these three nations constitute in geographical area the exact boundaries that are now constituted by the nation of Jordan. And that when Jehoshaphat came against these, he sent his singers out first, and the Edomites, the Midianites, and the Edomites, the Moabites, and the Ammonites were thrown into confusion, and first it says that the Midianites the Moabites slew the Edomites, and then the Moabites and the Ammonites turned one upon the other, until all of the hosts were destroyed, and all Israel had to do was to go in and pick up the spoil, and they never lost a man. And we found how this pattern is still holding good, that today the way God is destroying, or the opposition of Israel is, that they're warring against themselves. It's amazing, isn't it, how much Israel is in the news. You know, I was watching the CBS Walter Cronkite story, and last night, and they nearly always have one story of the nation of Israel, but last night they had two. They had one story about Israel at the beginning of the program and one at the end of the program. And it's got to where that this is the focal point of the history of the world, day by day. We learned just this week that some Israelites have been turned loose by the Russians. And this is a rather unusual thing. 6 of them have been let go, and some of them have gone back to Israel. Well, we don't know what the portent is here, but it's probably going to be important for them, for God to have a few people in Israel that knows how to speak Russian real well. They might have a use for it, very soon. So you can't tell. Now, you might say, well, what motivated the Russians to let some of the belligerent type of Israelites go? Well, there's no answer to that, except God has some purposes, and He's bringing all of this into a head. So the Bible predicts that this great northern confederacy of soldiers will be defeated in the same manner that that the enemies of God's people, the enemies of Israel, have been defeated all through the centuries. That is, man against man. And we find out of this great horde that comes down, literally millions and millions of people, that only 1 out of 6 will be left to return. And it will take 7 months just to bury the dead, it says. And that they'll have men hired to do nothing but go around and hunt the bones of the dead that the birds have picked off and bury them. And that there'll be so many around even after so long a time that the tourists, it says, see, the Bible knew there'd be a lot of tourists to Israel because it speaks of the travelers, the tourists there, and they would spot bones, and they'd call on the man that was supposed to bury them to bury the bones. That this would take place in this time. Then we found out in our studies last week some of the things that the Bible says will happen to the nations around Israel. For instance, we found that the Bible has much to say about Egypt. We found out that Egypt is going to have a civil war, yet future, and that the way that war is going to be fought is going to be Egyptian against Egyptian. Just the same pattern. We found out also that the Nile River is going to be dried up. We found there's going to be a great earthquake in Egypt. It's not said particularly that the earthquake will be the reason for the drying up of the Nile, but certainly you can put the two together. And it says also that their brooks of defense, or their waterways of defense, shall be destroyed. It says also that a very cruel ruler will rule over Egypt, and that the people will completely lose all of their nerve, and they'll just have no fervor. It also says that the Egyptians will fear the Israelites, and that the Israelites will hold a power over them. Now, all of these things we found in God's prophetic words. Some of them we can see happening right before our eyes, and some of them have happened just in the last few months, in the last few years. Now we'll get back to the 9th chapter of Daniel. And remember now, Daniel had been in captivity with his people 70 years because his people had not obeyed God, had turned from God, and God had permitted them to be captured by an evil nation, the nation of Babylon. And Daniel was a godly man, and Daniel was praying. He's an old man now, probably between 80 and 90, and he's praying to God about delivering his people in his city. And he says, God, how about telling me what you're going to do? And God answers in this dream or this vision. He sends Gabriel. Notice in the 21st verse, yea, while I was speaking in prayer, even the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, touched me about the time of the evening oblation. That means the evening sacrifice. And he informed me and talked with me and said, O Daniel, I am now come forth to give thee skill and understanding. At the beginning of thy supplications the commandment came forth, and I am come to show thee, for thou art greatly beloved. Therefore understand the matter and consider the vision. 70 weeks are determined upon my people. Now, the angel Gabriel is informing Daniel of concerning his people, the nation of Israel. First, we need to understand the word that is translated weeks here is simply a word which simply means sevens. In the Hebrew language, any period of time, any time you spoke of 7 periods of time, this word was used. It could mean 7 days or 7 weeks or 7 months or 7 years or 7 millennia, or it just meant 7 periods of time. So we might better read this, 7 periods of time, or 70 groups of 7 are determined upon thy people and upon the holy city. He said, now David, you've been praying about this, and I'm going to tell you, there's going to be 70 periods of time, yes. 70 periods of time measured in sevens. In this case, we're going to find out it's 70 weeks of years. That is to say, it's going to be 70 times 7 years are determined upon thy people. He's saying, Daniel, 490 years must go by of history concerning your people before the Messiah can come. Your nation has yet a history. They're going to have a history of 490 years, or 70 times 7. And because it's going to take this long, number one, to finish the transgression. That is to say, it's going to take that long before God feels like that Israel sufficiently understands that they're transgressing against God. And to make an end of sins, or to atone for sins, or to pay the sin price, and to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision of the prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore, to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah, the Prince, shall be 7 weeks, or that is 7 times 7 years. 7, remember this, every time you see weeks, 1 week is 1 period of 7 years. Shall be 7 weeks, and 62 weeks, and the street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublous times. Now notice, he says it's going to be 70 weeks. And again, remember, when I say a week, I mean 7 years, not 7 days. There's going to be 70 weeks. Now there's going to be 7 weeks during which the walls are going to be rebuilt, the walls of the city, in troublous times, after the decree is given. Well, soon after this, Cyrus permitted a group of Israelites to come back to Jerusalem and start rebuilding the city of Jerusalem. And it took just 49 years from the time they started building until the walls of the city were rebuilt. The streets and the walls of the city, not the temple, but the streets and the walls of the city were rebuilt. So this is 7/7, see, 49 years. And then it says that there shall also be 62 weeks, or 62 weeks. Now, if you'll add all that up together, it equals 69 weeks, or, in our terminology here, 483 days. Well, that leaves 7, doesn't it? That leaves 1 week of years. It says there's going to be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. 7 and 62 is 69. It leaves 1 week, or 1 period of 7 years, entirely unaccounted for. Now let's see what's going to happen at that end of that 69 years, or that 69 weeks. 69 times 7 years, or 483 years. 26th verse. And after 62 weeks, you had your 7 weeks, and then 62 weeks. It's really, if you add it together, it's after 69 weeks. Shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. Now, obviously, this is a reference to the crucifixion of Christ, the crucifixion of Messiah. And if all you have to do is get a calendar, and you can find out it was exactly 483 years from the time that Cyrus said they could rebuild 483. But himself, and the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and sanctuary, and the end of it shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the here's your conform the covenant with many for to cease, and for the overspreading of consummation that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. Now what is being said here? It says that there's going to be a period of 49 years, and then there's going to be 432. Okay, there's going to be 49 years, and then there's going to be 432 years. The 49 years is the length of time it took the temple to be rebuilt. And then there's going to be 432?
What was that number again?
62 times 7.
62 times 7. That's 434. So there's going to be 49 years, and then 434. And at the end of those 2 periods of time, the Messiah is going to be cut off, but not for himself. Cut off for someone else, in other words. And then there shall be another week left. And in the middle of that week that's left, there's going to be a covenant. In the middle of that week, the sacrifice and the sacrifices are going to be caused to cease. Now, if we read carefully in the book of Revelation and compare it with this, here's what we find out is going to happen. That the temple was rebuilt. Remember, Solomon built the first temple about 1,000 years before Christ, 900 and some years before Christ. That temple was destroyed when the children of Israel were taken away to Babylon, about 600 B.C. And then the Persian king, under whom the Israelites were at that time, permitted them to come back and rebuild the temple. And it was rebuilt 400 and some years before Christ. The story of this, of course, is in the book of Nehemiah, the rebuilding of the temple. And then, after a couple of hundred years, that temple was destroyed. And then you'll remember a third temple was built under the reign of King Herod. That's the temple which was at Jerusalem at the time that Christ was living on this earth. But that temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 A.D. Remember, Christ said that not one stone would be left upon another. One day, when the disciples said, "Look what great stones these are, and look at the mammoth building we have here, and the great strength it has." And Christ said, "The time will come when not one stone will be left on another of this temple." And of course, that happened in 70 A.D. But the Bible says that there's still a time coming when there'll be another temple. Well, if 69 weeks, or 69 groups of 7 years, 69 weeks of years, 483 years, went by between the order to rebuild Jerusalem and the time that Messiah was cut off, where does your other 7 years come in? Well, let's turn again to our scripture in Romans chapter 11. Romans chapter 11. Verse 25, where Paul says, and he wrote this, of course, after Christ was crucified and then risen again, "For I would not, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own conceit, that blindness in part is happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in." Now, if we had time to look up all these scriptures, we'd find that in the 15th chapter of Acts, they had a council, and they decided that the prophet, one of the Old Testament prophets, had prophesied that the time would come when God would lay aside the nation of Israel for a period of time to do something else. And we call this the church age. It began at Pentecost. God laid aside his program of dealing through Israel at the end of the 69th week, and the 70th week has never come along yet. That last 7 years is in what's known as a hiatus. He cut it off. He cut the Jewish calendar off and stopped dealing with the nation of Israel for a period of time. And that period of time is until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. Now, remember we saw a prophecy by Hosea where he said that in the third day that God would again come back to his people, or in the 3,000th year. Well, that means the 3,000th year from the time God dispossessed the nation of Israel. His indignation would be over against Israel. And that started 600 years B.C. So sometime in the next 400 years, that last 7 years has got to start turning. Well, we think that time is very near because, you see, God is already restoring the land. He's already got the people back in the land in unbelief. And so many of these happenings are happening in front of us every day. So it seems to be about time for God to start that last 7 years. Well, what's going to trigger that last 7 years? The thing that's going to trigger it is the rapture of the church. You see, God doesn't deal with Israel as a nation and with the church at the same time. And right now, he's carrying on his program through the church. He's been doing that ever since Pentecost, when the nation of Israel rejected their Messiah. But he says plainly he's not turned them away forever, and he's going to bring back. And so just as soon as he takes the church out of this earth, then he's going to start dealing with the nation of Israel again, and that last 7 years is going to start. Now I'm going to give you a quick preview of just the history of that 7 years. It hasn't started yet, but I'm going to tell you some of the things that will happen, and then we'll find them. We'll go in the book of Revelation and some other places, and we'll find some of these things. Here's what's going to happen. Almost immediately, as soon as the church is raptured, God is going to choose 144,000 Jews to carry his message all over the world. That's how the 7 years is going to start. He's going to get him 144,000 witnesses. Now, it'll be 12,000 from each of the tribes. There's, of course, various groups of people that's been claiming for years, or any number of groups, that they are the 144,000. They always get to a problem when their numbers get to be over 144,000. They got to figure out some other way to figure it out. And the best way to handle those people is to ask them which one of the 12 tribes they're from, because the Bible plainly says it'll be 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. So God's going to call out 144,000 Jewish people, and they're going to spread his gospel all over the world. Now, it's going to be a pretty good climate for doing this, and we're going to find out why this climate is good for doing it when we study the professing church, or the ecumenical movement, and the future of it. But that's not our study right now. Maybe we'll take them up next, see. But they're going to have a good climate for spreading this gospel, and they're going to be God's true spokesman for for a period of time, 144,000. And millions of people are going to get saved. Now, presumably, based on the language in 2nd chapter, 2 Thessalonians, nobody will be saved who had a clear opportunity of being saved before the rapture. In other words, this is for people that have not yet had an opportunity or have not clearly heard God's message. But millions of people are going to be saved in the world through the witness of these 144,000. Then, right near the beginning of their ministry, there's going to be a great number of Jews, or most of the Jews, still won't believe. And they'll be in Israel, and they'll rebuild the temple right near the beginning of this 7-year period. The temple is going to be rebuilt under the blessings of a world leader who will form a covenant with the nation of Israel. They'll have an agreement. And Israel will start up its old worship practices in unbelief. They'll start slaughtering crucifixion lambs. They'll have an altar and everything right there in Jerusalem like they used to have. And they'll have their morning oblation and their evening oblation, and they'll have a good time observing all of these Old Testament customs. But they won't be believing in Jesus Christ the Messiah. The 144,000 will, but they won't be in Jerusalem. They'll be all over the world. They're missionaries to the world. They're believing Jews. The great bulk of the Jews will be unbelieving. And they'll be carrying on their old sacrifices under the protective custody of a world ruler. Then we're going to find, after 3.5 years, or right in the middle of the 7 years, that God is going to banish Satan from his present domain, and Satan is going to be confined to the earth. And when Satan gets to the earth, he doesn't want anybody worshiping anything but him. And he's going to have a statue. He's going to have a statue put in the middle of the Jews' temple. It's called the Abomination of Desolation. He's going to put it there. And the Jews will be forced to worship that statue of a man that Satan indwells. Now, many of the Jews will do that, but some will refuse to. And they're told then to flee from that city. And then there's a concerted effort to annihilate the Jews. And during the next 3.5 years, 2/3 of the Jewish population of the world is going to be slaughtered. The unbelieving Jews. 2/3 of them, and only 1/3 will survive that terrible slaughter. Only 1/3 will be left at the end of this seven-year period. Now it's called by various names. It's called by the time of sorrows. It's called the time of Jacob's troubles, and so forth. Now the 144,000 will not be permitted to witness during the last half of this 7-year period. They'll only have 3.5 years of ministry. And God will providently protect them during the last 3.5 years. He'll put a seal on them, and the world rulers will not be able to touch them. They'll be particularly protected. And God's witness during the last 3.5 years will be 2 Jewish prophets. In fact, it'll be Moses and Elijah. Moses will be resuscitated. That is to say, not in his resurrection body, but you know, if you remember the story, Moses' body was taken away. You can read it in Jude, the book of Jude, where the angel Michael and Satan had a little argument over the body of Moses. Moses' body has never been found. God has a use for it. It's going to come back. And then Elijah, you know, never died. He was just translated up into the heavens. Well, Moses and Elijah are going to come back. Now, the forecast of this was on the Mount of Transfiguration. You remember when Christ went up to the top of the Mount of Transfiguration? Well, this is a picture of the coming kingdom. And we see Moses and Elijah up there. And this is sort of a prophetic portent of the fact that they are going to come back to this earth. The last chapter of the last book in the Old Testament mentions both of these prophets. And it plainly says that Elijah will come back before the Messiah does. This is why a lot of people asked John the Baptist. When John the Baptist came, they asked him if he was Elijah, because the Bible said Elijah was to come back. Well, we'll get into that. So the last 3.5 years, God's messengers on this earth are going to be 2 human beings, 2 Jews, Elijah and Moses, and they'll prophesy in Jerusalem for 3.5 years, and nobody will be able to kill them until the end of the 3.5 years, and then they'll be killed. And the whole world will rejoice because they're tired of hearing the preaching. And they're going to turn the television sets on, and they're going to see them dead. Then when they think they've really done them in, God's going to bring them back to life, and they're going to go up to heaven. Now, all this sounds rather fantastic, but it's not any more fantastic than the things that have been happening. And this is what God says. Now, I've tried to give you an overview so that you can kind of tie these scriptures together as we come in. I'm going to give you some scriptures to study before we finish tonight so that you can look up some of it yourself. But right now, let's turn to the book of Revelation, the 12th chapter, and we see a view of the nation of Israel. It kind of looks backwards and forwards, and it'll kind of set the stage for us. Revelation chapter 12. And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. Now this is an analogy or a picture taken from a dream that Joseph had back in the 37th chapter of Genesis. You can go back and read it yourself. It's in Genesis chapter 37, beginning in the 9th verse. Here's the gist of it. Joseph was a young man, 17 years old. And you'll remember he had 11 brothers, 10 older than he was, and then Benjamin was younger. And he had a dream. He had a couple of dreams. But this one dream was, he dreamed that the sun and the moon and 11 stars bowed down and worshipped him. Now, Jacob, his father, he told the dream to Jacob. Told it to his brothers, and it made them mad. And he told it to Jacob, and Jacob interpreted it. He says, now, you're full of foolishness, boy. What you're saying is that your father, called his father the sun, and your mother the moon, and your 11 brothers, the stars, are going to bow down to you? Well, see, it was a prophetic dream, because that's exactly what happened later on. But you see, Joseph is a type of Christ. And this picture comes from that. The woman is the nation of Israel. And the sun and the moon under her feet mean that the time will come when Israel again will be in command of the things of this world. Just like the sun rules the day and the moon rules the night, one day Israel will rule. This is the analogy here. And upon her head a crown of 12 stars. This speaks of the fact that there are 12 tribes and there are 12 apostles. Remember, Christ said to his apostles, I believe it's the 19th chapter of Matthew, one of them said, look, we've forsaken all to come with you. What do we have when you set up your kingdom? And Christ said, well, the time will come in my kingdom when you 12 men will sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. That does not include Judas, of course. And there's a question about whether it includes Matthias or Paul. But anyway, 12 apostles on 12 thrones, ruling the 12 tribes of Israel. Secondly, when she, being with child, cried, travailing in birth, and pain to be delivered. Now this speaks of Christ being born from the nation of Israel. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, behold, a great red dragon, this is Satan, having 7 heads and 10 horns. This is Satan as he's exemplified by the Antichrist, and 7 crowns upon his head. And his tail drew a third part of the stars of heaven. This is one of the scriptures where the stars of heaven mean here the angels, and this is the verse that lets you know that 1/3 of the angelic hosts were followed after Satan. And he did cast them to earth, and the dragon, that is Satan, stood before the woman, who was ready to deliver, to devour her child as soon as it was born. That means Satan was all set. And this is speaking of the time when Satan, using Herod, attempted to slaughter all the babies, so that the king, Christ, wouldn't come about. And she brought forth a man-child. This speaks of Israel being the one that brought forth Christ, who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. Now this should clear up any matter we might have about who the man-child is, because it's a reference to the 2nd Psalm where it says the Messiah shall rule the nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to be caught up unto God to his throne. This speaks of the ascension of Christ, where he is now, sitting at the right hand of God. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. And if you'll figure this up, you'll find out this is exactly 3.5 years. So everything up to through the 5th verse is history. It's history of Israel. And beginning with the 6th verse, we have prophecy concerning Israel. Well, this lets us know that Israel, or the believing Israel, is going to be protected during the last half of the tribulation. Now, this is carried on. We have an interlude here, which we'll get into when we talk about the war of Satan at the middle of the tribulation, but let's skip on down to the 13th verse. And when the dragon saw that he was cast into the earth, he persecuted the woman who brought forth the man-child. This speaks to the fact that I just got through telling you that two-thirds of the nation of Israel would be destroyed during the last half of the tribulation. And to the woman were given, this is those who were saved, two wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place, where she is nourished for a time, times and a half times, from the face of the serpent. Now, a time, times and a half times is another way of saying 3.5 years. This is explained in Daniel. But we have 3.5 years described here in Revelation in several different ways. One time it'll say 42 months, another time it'll say 3.5 years, another time it'll say 1,260 days, and another time it'll say a time, times and a half times. That's a time, 1 year, and time, 2 years, and a half time, 3.5 years. And the serpent cast out of his mouth water like a flood after the woman. Well, I could give you some scriptures that would let you know that this is speaking of a great army. This flood is a great army of people. For instance, the Lord so classified it at one occasion. You can look up, the best probably, if you will read the 124th Psalm, it'll explain that to you. That this flood is like a great army. Also, Jeremiah 46:7. But read the 124th Psalm, and I believe you'll get it there. That he might cause her to be carried away by the flood, or just be enveloped by the nations, and the earth, or the land, helped the woman, and the earth opened up her mouth and swallowed up the flood. This speaks of a coming earthquake. And the dragon cast out of his mouth. This is speaking of the armies that were sent forth to destroy all of Israel were swallowed up by an earthquake just at the time when they would have destroyed Israel. And the dragon was wroth with the woman and went to make war with the remnant of her seed who kept the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. Now let me put this in perspective if I can. First, the first few verses of the 12th chapter is simply giving you the history of Israel in symbolic language. Then you have, in the latter part of the 12th chapter, you have the prophecy of what's going to happen to Israel during the last half of the tribulation. That is, the godly believing part will be particularly divinely protected by God, and the unbelieving part will be destroyed. So that probably the greater part of the 1/3 who come through the tribulation will be believers, and the ones who didn't come through would be unbelievers. God has a way of protecting those that are his own. Now you're going to say, how does he do that? Well, the believing one will have listened to Christ. Let's go back to Matthew 24, and you'll see how God does this. Matthew chapter 24. Just before Christ was crucified, this episode happened. Matthew 24, and Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. This is Herod's temple, which was the third temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Now we told you that this happened in 70 A.D. Christ made this prophecy right here about 32 A.D. And about 38 years after he prophesied that this temple would be utterly destroyed, it was utterly destroyed by the Roman army. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world, or the end of the age? And Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all of these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. Now, haven't you heard that when you hear a lot of wars and rumors of war, that it means it's a sign that the end is coming? Well, you see, that's not what the Bible says. It says that's a sign that the end is not yet. You see, at the time Jesus said this, people didn't know what a war was. It was during the time which generally referred to as Pax Roma, or the Roman peace. Rome had pacified the whole world. Now, they knew what violence was like, but there wasn't but one nation. So there wasn't any such thing as one nation warring another nation. So what Jesus was saying, the time's going to come in the future when nations are going to war against nations. Now, you fellows haven't seen that in your time, because there aren't any nations to war against Rome. That was all a thing of the past. But since the time's coming when there's going to be wars and rumors of wars, but don't let that alarm you, because that's not the sign of the end. The end is not yet. See, they had asked him the question, what is a sign of the end of the age, or the end of the world? They said to him, when he said that the temple will be torn stone by stone, see, they thought nothing but the end of the world could be so great that it would tear down that temple. So they thought that when he said the temple would be torn down, that he was talking about the end of the world. So they said, well, when is it? When shall these things be? When is the end of the world? What are the signs of the end of the world? He says, well, before the end of the world comes, you're going to hear a lot about wars and rumors of wars, but the end is not yet. That's not a sign of the end, when you hear about a lot of wars. 7th verse, for nation shall rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. It doesn't say that it's the end of things, and certainly you wouldn't call the end of this age, you wouldn't call the time when the millennium starts, for instance, you wouldn't call that the beginning of sorrows, would you? So he says, we hear about all these wars, and there's earthquakes and famines and pestilences. That's the beginning of sorrows. Then in the 9th verse it says, and they shall deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. Well, that certainly has taken place. He's talking about the Jews now. And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another, and many false prophets shall arise, and shall deceive many, and because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. But he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. Now this is talking again to the nation of Israel, and the end means the end of the age. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. So what is the sign of when the end shall come? When the gospel of the kingdom shall be preached to all the ends of the earth. Now this is particularly, this sign is the nation of Israel. And it's a sign that they'll understand during that 70th week after the church is raptured. This is not a sign for the church. The church doesn't live by signs. Israel, the Jews require a sign. We walk by faith, not by sight. We're not looking for signs. We're looking for the Lord. But the Jews shall be looking for signs. And the sign that they're going to look for is when they're going to see. Now, who is it going to know that the gospel is being proclaimed to every end of the earth? Is it going to be the unbelieving Jews? They're not paying attention to it. It's going to be the believing Jews. They'll understand this, see. They'll understand it. When they see this 144,000 Jews spreading God's message to the whole earth, they'll understand that he's talking here about the gospel of the kingdom. That is the same message that John the Baptist preached, repent for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. They'll understand that the end is drawing nigh, and that's their sign. The wars and rumors of wars have been going on, pestilence have been going on, famines have been going on. All of that didn't mark the coming of the end. No, the thing that marked the coming of the end was that the 144 Jews witnessing all over the world was carrying the message to all the ends of the earth. Now let's read on. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the Daniel, the prophet stand in the holy place? Whosoever readeth, let him understand. Okay, here we are. Back in Daniel. Daniel said that in the middle of the 70th week, 3.5 years after the Jews make a covenant with the Antichrist or the world ruler, 3.5 years after that the Jewish sacrificial system is going to be brought to a halt by the world ruler, and that they're going to put a statue in the holy place, which is called an abomination, because anything, God calls an abomination anything that his people worship other than himself, through his worship system. So he says in the middle of the week, remember we read back over into Daniel, in the midst of the week, and there's going to be a covenant for 1 week, and in the midst of the week, that the abomination of desolation is going to be set up in the temple. So Jesus Christ says here to the Jews, and they're going to read this and understand it. He says, when you see that statue go up in the holy place, now that's not there yet because there's not even a holy place there. The Mosque of Omar is standing there. But the Mosque of Omar is not going to be there much. It's not long for this world because there's got to be a temple there. And there's going to be sacrifices going on for 3.5 years. So we know it has to be 3.5 years yet before this abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel can stand in the holy place. Now, of course, before that 3.5 years even starts, you're going to be raptured. So you won't be here to see that unless you see it from upstairs looking down. But you won't be here. Anyway, see, this is how God's going to protect the believers. They're going to have the Word of God. This Word doesn't change. And they're going to say, well, one of us, these disciples, asked Christ a question. Back in the 24th chapter of Matthew, asked him a question. What would be a sign? And Christ answered them and said, first, when you see the gospel going out to all the nations of the earth, when you see it, you Jewish people see it. And then he says, when you see this abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel in the holy place, then I want you to do something. Now what? 16th verse. Then let them who are in Judea flee unto the mountains. Whosoever readeth, let him understand. See? So at the middle of the 7-year period, the believing Jews are going to flee. And God's going to hide them and protect them miraculously in the wilderness of these same countries, Moab, Ammon, and Edom, or that same geographical area that Jordan possesses today. He's going to miraculously protect them there in that land for 3.5 years. Who is he going to protect? Those that read his word and believe, who read and understand. The believers among the Jews. The non-believers are not going to run. They're not going to even believe. They're going to stay right there and they're going to be slaughtered by the Antichrist. Let them who are in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him who is in the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Neither let him who is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe unto them who are with child and to those who give suck to children in those days. But pray that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. Remember, see, this is back in a Jewish economy where they observe the Sabbath day and all such as that. For then shall a great tribulation. See, now here you're going to start the last 3.5 years. The last 3.5 years of the tribulation is called the Great Tribulation. It's called the time of Jacob's trouble. For then, when you see the abomination of desolation in the holy place, then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, nor ever shall be, and except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake, that is the saved Jews, those days shall be shortened. Then if any man shall say unto you, Lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not. See, the Antichrist is the false prophet's going to claim he's it. For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it was possible, they should deceive the very elect. Behold, I have told you before. Wherefore, if they shall say unto you, behold, he is in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he is in the secret chambers, believe it not. For as the lightning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. He says, look, you won't have to mistake. When I come back, the whole world's going to know it. It's going to be like the most brightening light, the brightest flashing of lightning you ever saw in your life. There won't be any mistake about it. When I come back, don't believe anybody that says the Christ is here. See, that's Christ predicted in the 5th chapter of John that they didn't receive him, but one who comes in his own name they would receive. Speaking of the Antichrist, he says, well, you true believers won't have to worry about that, because I'll tell you, I'm not going to come back until you see me coming with a brilliance that'll shatter the whole world. So when you hear about somebody says Christ has come back, don't you believe it? Because that's not how I'm going to come. It's not going to be any secret. And everybody will know. Every knee shall bow, and every eye shall behold. Everybody will know what's happened. You won't have to have anybody to tell you. So if you hear a rumor that Christ has come back, don't believe it. You won't have to make any mistake. Now notice in the 29th verse, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, the moon shall not give its light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in clouds of heaven with power and great glory, and he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heaven to the other. So you see, he says there won't be any mistake about when he comes. Now let's just have a brief review. I told you I'd give you some scriptures. You can read about the 144,000 in the 7th chapter of Revelation. You can read about this great missionary force and all the people that come to Christ through their ministry. You can read about them in the 7th chapter of Revelation. And then you can read about God protecting them in the 14th chapter of Revelation. So there are your two chapters, Revelation chapter 7, Revelation chapter 14. Those are the chapters concerning, and it's not in sign language, so you can understand it. It's very plain. Now, some of you are going to wonder when you start reading through these 12 tribes, you're going to wonder why you don't read about the tribe of Dan. There's 12 tribes there, but the tribe of Dan is omitted. Well, you know, there's really 13 tribes of Israel, aren't there? Because remember, there were 12 sons, and then God took Levi and all of his descendants for himself, and then he split the tribe of Joseph in two, that is Manasseh and Ephraim. So that actually there were 13 counting the Levites. They didn't have a portion of land. And the Levites are mentioned here in the 7th chapter of Revelation, but the tribe of Dan isn't. One of the most interesting Bible studies is to trace the tribe of Dan and to find out why none of the descendants of Dan are going to be part of the 144,000. Now, God has not cast Dan away, because when we read in the 48th chapter of Ezekiel, when we talk about the millennium, Dan is the first tribe that's mentioned as having eternal inheritance in the land. So God hasn't cast them away, but they're not going to be permitted to be missionaries during the first half of the tribulation. Not a one of them. There'll be 144,000 Jews and not a Danite among the group of them. And there's a reason why. And if you want to do some private study and research, just look up, I'll give you some clues as to where to start looking. In the 49th chapter of Genesis, 49th chapter of Genesis, Jacob makes a prophecy. Just before he died, he made a prophecy concerning each of his sons and their progeny. And he made a prophecy about Dan, the tribe of Dan. In the 33rd chapter of Deuteronomy, just before Moses died, he made a prophetic utterance concerning each of the tribes. And he prophesied concerning Dan. Then, if you want to read about how the tribe of Dan really got into trouble, read the 18th chapter of Judges. I've given you quite a lot of chapters to read there. But some of you may want to study this for yourself and find out why Dan, the tribe of Dan, is not mentioned in the 7th chapter of Revelation, when you have enumerated the 144,000, 12 from each tribe. Let's see, that last scripture I said, Judges chapter 18, I'm going to have to look that up because I'm not sure I'm right there. Yeah. Judges chapter 18.
And this was the end of this tape.